Now turn to questions from the committee, and I get to begin. Aging infrastructure and deferred maintenance has left our water systems vulnerable, as I think we've all laid out here. And we unfortunately saw the worst of that play out last year in Jackson, Mississippi, a disaster which was decades in the making. Unlike other forms of infrastructure like bridges and roads, clean drinking water is not primarily funded by taxes. Instead, more than 90% of the average utilities revenues comes directly from constituents' water bills. Ms. Menard, I commend you for your efforts to secure various forms of federal and state funding, including through a WIFIA loan, LEWAP, the SRFs, rate increases, and other sources. But not every water agency is as adept as you've been in Santa Cruz, often due to staff and other capacity challenges. Can you speak to the challenges of accessing funding from so many different sources? And is it time for maybe a new paradigm for how we finance and fund water infrastructure?
Thank you for the question, Senator Padilla. I'd be happy to speak to that question. One of the things I think that's really important for us to think about as we think about affordability today and going forward is how are we going to cover these very big costs and for spreading out over a relatively small rate base, whether you're one of the rural systems that was spoken by one of my colleagues, whether you're a small system spoken by Mr. Jones, these are big questions. And even in Santa Cruz, the number I gave you of $650 million for a capital program to rehabilitate, replace, and climate-proof our water utility is a pretty darn big number when you spread it across 27,000 accounts. And it results in the kind of rate increases that we've been seeing that are really creating these problems for our low-income customers. I do think that unlike so much other of our infrastructure, we do need to think about whether or not the business model we're using to fund water utilities, local water utilities, is really broken and can get us where we need to go through this next cycle of reinvestment. And if it's not, then what is the right solution? And I think that there needs to be more state and federal funding that comes in to help us with these things. Some of that's loan funding, and it's great, and we've obviously accessed that. We've gone from about say $14 million in debt in 2014 to now Santa Cruz has about $370 million in debt and more coming because of the funding strategy. That is a very significant debt burden for a community to take on, and a lot of communities simply won't do it because of fear of how that will require rates to increase. So I think it is time for us to be looking at new paradigms.
Thank you. My next question is in the area of the rising costs of water. The graph behind me illustrates how household water and wastewater bills have increased by 160% since 1998. That's a greater rate of growth than electricity bills, rent, or medical bills. The burden of unsafe and unaffordable water disproportionately impacts lower-income communities and communities of color. As Mr. Jones shared in his testimony, many rural communities, including tribal communities and farm worker communities, and communities near sites of legacy industrial contamination, in reality pay twice for safe drinking water, once for the contaminated water flowing from their taps, and once again for the costlier bottled water that they must rely on. As the disparity between water rate increases and income growth has increased, so too have household water affordability issues. Mr. Jones, ratepayers, especially low-income households, cannot continue to bear the burden of deteriorating infrastructure. Federal investment in water infrastructure has declined by 77% since its peak in the 1970s. How critical, in your opinion, is federal investment in water infrastructure for supporting water affordability?
Thank you for that. It's absolutely critical that we continue and expand the overall investment and also prioritize making sure that those investments can reach the communities that need them most, that have had the biggest challenges in accessing funding historically. And part of the work we do through some of the expanded community outreach and engagement projects is do the work of organizing community residents to really understand what water solutions are and get them in support of that. A lot of the work we do focuses on consolidations, which honestly is some of the most cost-effective ways to ensure we can build a stronger ratepayer base to be able to cover these costs. And in order to get a consolidation going, you really have to get two communities who have historically not been working together to work together. And that takes a lot of work on the ground. So making sure that the funding sources are being paired with the right types of outreach and engagement is absolutely critical to make sure that these solutions that we are funding are making the most impact. And then, finally, I think, as we've all said, that there needs to be the focus on affordability when it comes to funding these projects, because even with some of these solutions, there's going to be increases in rates. And that's hard for customers, especially if you were a low-income farm worker, undocumented community like we work with, to understand that this solution comes at a cost. And so making sure we have a program to ensure water is affordable is absolutely critical to make sure that we can get to these solutions for contamination and other issues.
Thank you. Senator Lummis.
Mr. Pepper, again, thanks for being here. As you know, I've been focused on